All right. Over the past few months, I have been really connecting with a beautiful soul and a rising star in the psychedelic community. Now, I don't say rising stars in the glamorous sense. I'm really saying this with deep inner burning wisdom. She's teaching people the nuances of microdosing as well as the general use of plant medicines, and also getting into the active use of ways of striving for our higher potential with the use of technology and anything that is at our disposal. It's a very genuine woman here. Her name is Laura Dawn. You can find her as the host of the Psychedelic Leadership Podcast with Live Free Laura D. You'll find her all over social media. And you are really going to want to stay tuned for this amazing podcast. There's a lot we're going to talk about today on the Ben Stewart Podcast. Let's invite Laura Dawn into this ongoing psychedelic renaissance series on the Ben Stewart Podcast.
All right.
Ahoy, mateys. Thank you all for joining me. You'll notice that I have a little bit different of a background. It's because I'm on a road trip right now. I'm in SoCal, California. That's not SoCal. It's right around Santa Cruz area. And I'm really excited to invite Laura Dawn into this Ben Stewart Podcast, but the ongoing Psychedelic Renaissance series. So real quick, just thank you, Laura, so much for joining us here. Looks like she lost some audio.
Are you able to hear me, Laura? I think she was saying she might have issue hearing you, Ben. Let's just double check.
I can't hear you guys.
You can't hear either of us?
We can hear you. It's all right. Not a problem at all. Let's see if we can just figure out real quick.
In the meantime, while you're trying to figure that out,
I believe it might be her speakers. If we just need to change her audio settings. Let me see. Her speakers, we need to change the audio settings probably for her speakers. If you
is that something you'll have to do in the chat?
Yeah, if you want to, real quick, we can go back to the starting soon screen if we want to just give her a call. I think that'll probably be easiest, and then just
let's do it. Let's do it. Signing off, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be right back.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Sorry for that little snafu.
Are you able to
Technical difficulties.
Are you able to hear us
Yeah.
now, Laura?
Yes.
All right,
I
beautiful.
All
can hear you.
right. All right. Perfect. Well, I hope everyone could hear the intro. I really wanted to, I would have loved for you to have heard the intro just to make sure that I didn't miss anything. But I was basically just saying that I really love that you are a part of this burgeoning field of psychedelics and going deeper than just what it used to be, which was just purely steeped in academia, as much as academia is so important. I really like that when I was on your podcast and we were talking about higher human potential, and I remember you asking me, there's that fine line between people who want to be purely analytical, just talk about the facts and the science, and others who are like, well, we're talking psychedelics here. You're allowed to go a little bit beyond. And what I love is that you're at least considering these types of nuances. But beyond that, before I dive into, because I want to ask you about some of the higher education that you're pursuing, I want to ask and just bring it into the conversation. What got you launched into what it is that you're doing now? You have your hands in such a beautiful melting pot of using plants, using technology, and also just engaging with people to access their own higher potential. What got you started on this?
I would say so much of the work that I do is just such a result of, I want to call it direct downloads, but just a lot of deep work that I've done with the plants and receiving a lot of guidance and tapping into these visionary dimensions. And then taken on the role of transmuting those visions into my reality. And so I have a very strong parallel track. I've been an entrepreneur my whole life. I was raised by two entrepreneurs, and that's such an interesting lens to be given as a child. I remember the first time, I think I was about 8 years old. My parents used to really encourage us to always look for possibilities and opportunities. And I pitched my first business plan when I was about 8. And that was like our family dinner style. We would get together for Sunday dinners. And then by dessert, we were pitching business ideas to each other. And my parents were always really supportive. And they were also very much so like outside the box in a lot of different ways. And they also really supported formal education as well. And I had my first high dose psilocybin experience when I was about 14, 15. And of course, that just deeply influenced my whole path and everything that I'm doing. And it's not so linear. It's like the story of our lives is definitely so complex. But those are two very strong tracks that have really influenced where I am today. And mostly, through a lot of the struggle that I went through, struggling with depression, struggling with addiction, and going through those experiences. And, I'll never forget having one really incredible high dose LSD journey where I walked through a door and I kicked an addiction to cocaine that night, and I never walked back, And so it was really powerful experiences like that. And then when you come out the other side of experiences like that, where for anyone who struggled with depression or addiction, that feeling of just not being able to almost think about anything else. It's just like very, very much like ruminative, almost being like locked in a small, dark room and not knowing where the handle is. And then once you have this experience, and whether it's catalyzed by other healing modalities or therapy or psychedelic journeys, where you can actually find the doorknob and come out of the small dark room that it feels like you've been sort of locked in for a long time, and you realize that there's such a big, beautiful world out there, then the question is, now what? How do I use this incredible thing that we have, this consciousness, to be able to even have a conversation right now and just, built my life around that question of like, now what? How do I engage with this world with the intention of my path, of awakening, helping to serve other people on their path of awakening?
Yeah, man, that's such an interesting way that you arrived here, mainly because I resonate. I struggled with a few addictions. It didn't go too deeply into it, but the trying to quit and trying to quit for several years, and knowing that the depression and the self-abuse just verbally when you're trying to stop something that you know you shouldn't be doing it. and just what that whole process can do to you. It's very interesting that you also mentioned the entrepreneurial side of things. And the way that I want to kind of tie this together is we seem to engage in activities a lot of times. And this is, with the clients that I've worked with, I'm going to try not to make a blanket statement, but we seem to engage in activities that only afford us the amount of time to ask the questions, the overarching questions of life that we're willing to engage with at the time. And I've felt that the reason why I was so steeped in addiction and all these other aspects of, chasing fame when I was in the band and all these other things that I was really engaged in, it was almost as if I was intentionally zapping my own energy. So I couldn't ask the deeper questions that were burning inside of me. Like, what is this all for? I know I only have a glimpse here on planet Earth. What am I actually doing here? And in a way, it's like the ego knows that there's the pain of the addiction. There's the pain of all these, faulty desires that we chase. But there's also the pain of asking questions that we know we're not even close to the answers to. And so for me, it was actually the entrepreneurial spirit that I was afraid of. I was not afraid of getting up on stage and singing in front of thousands of people. I was not afraid of getting up and doing public talks, any of those things. It was really starting a business. It was the getting down, hunkering down, figuring out the nuts and bolts of it, launching it, getting other people involved, making sure that they feel like they're a part of the whole journey. And so I guess I want to ask, what has been the most difficult part of this journey leading up to where you are right now?
Oh, oh gosh. Well, we have a mutual friend, Charles Eisenstein, who, he spoke on my podcast not that long ago. And, he said something on that show that was really, that really struck me. And, he said, being a popular podcast host or having a large social media following doesn't inherently make you a leader. What makes you a leader is doing something from a guidance that's not already part of the general prevailing belief system. And that's what we need right now. He said, we need people to follow that impulse. And I've always been a kid who likes to beat to my own drum. It was like, oh, everyone's going that way. Like, what's off this deep end over here? And it's served me incredibly well over the years. And it's also been incredibly challenging and really difficult. And especially right now, we live in such divided, polarized times. And I would say the most difficult thing is having the courage to listen to the wisdom of your own heart and to be willing to step beyond the cultural constructs of narratives and stories. And so, ayahuasca has been my primary plant teacher for about 10 years. And some of the primary work I do right now is, and for the past few years, has been combining microdosing ayahuasca vine, Banisteriopsis caapi, with somatic coaching and mindset coaching. And I work a lot with entrepreneurs and leaders and executives and CEOs, and it's incredibly fulfilling work, and I really love it. And I went through a really intense experience about 6 months where this huge group of social justice warriors tried to cancel me, and it was really hard. And I really had to go in and really check myself, and I think that when we don't know, when we look out and look at what other people are doing, I think it's easy to judge. And there's this really great quote that's like, the more you get to know someone's stories, the more that your judgments and preconceived notions about them fall by the wayside. And I think that, yeah, right now, I think the hardest thing is really stepping out in alignment with your truth, your integrity, and not from a place of trying to convince anyone of anything, but just from a place of this is my truth. And this is my relationship with this plant medicine that I'm cultivating, that I'm growing, and that I make this medicine and work with people in this way that feels very deeply in alignment with my truth and how it served me and helped me. And I think somebody is always going to have something to say about what you're doing and have harsh criticisms. And I think that's the sort of Jedi training for this time, and just as like a note, Banisteriopsis caapi ayahuasca vine is legal in the US. So I'm not doing anything illegal when I talk about making this medicine as a microdosing substance and working with people in that way. And that's actually one alternative that a lot of people I work with, besides really resonating with that particular plant teacher, one of the main sort of drawbacks for working with psychedelics and with microdosing is people are afraid of being prosecuted. We still live in an era of prohibition, although that is changing very fast. But the message I keep getting from the plants is that these plants are here to help us wake up. I also had the privilege of interviewing Dennis McKenna for the podcast, and I love he's so poetic, and he said, the plants are the neurotransmitters of the Gaian mind telling us to wake up. And when we receive guidance, and even that guidance goes beyond what we can see, beyond this current reality that we live in. That's what being a visionary is. That's what being a creative visionary is. Creativity is our ability to make our ideas manifest in this world. And we need people who are willing to step out beyond as Charles said, the general prevailing belief systems. And that's incredibly hard to do. And I went through a really hard time, and this isn't about like, oh, feel bad for me, because like 99% of the people that, follow my content, they so support the work that I'm doing. And I'm so grateful for that. And I went through a month of just like not wanting to get out of bed and like opening up my email and someone telling me that like I should be so ashamed of myself that I should kill myself. And it's like, really, you consider yourself like on the plant medicine path? Like that's tricky for me, that's tricky. And so choosing to also respond rather than react, and not wanting to perpetuate, more division, and just not engaging in arguments. Like if people want to have conversations, it's like, yeah, let's come together. Let's talk about this. Like, tell me your perspective. That's like a direct way that we can help actually enhance cognitive flexibility. But like staying in that place of heart-centeredness, open heart, open mind, that's incredibly hard to do for all of us right now, and that's really, I feel like, what we're being called to do. So I would say, yeah, that's a long-winded answer, but that's, I would say, the most challenging thing. And I'll just add one more thing that, I'm about to host this 3-month microdosing mastermind with this group of entrepreneurs in the plant medicine space. And when people fill out their applications, I ask people to tell me, like, what are they really struggling with? What limiting beliefs are they working with? And like 70% of all applicants say they're afraid of stepping out and listening to their guidance because of what people are going to say, and how people are going to react, and the fear of imposter syndrome. And so this is so human, and I think when we do choose to step out and we give ourselves permission to step out, that we actually also have to hold that with a lot of responsibility. And so, yes, someone can make an argument that, the work I'm doing is culturally appropriating. And I also think we're facing a time of crisis on the planet, and it's an all hands on deck situation. And if I can work with one person and prevent them from not just committing suicide or, falling into depression, where we can't really contribute when we're working with depression, or even just constant low moods. And so if there's these amazing substances that help us to feel better, to reach out, to connect, to build bridges, to find new solutions to the most challenging problems that we face, then like I'm an advocate for that. And I have to stand in that truth. And this is the path of fire in a lot of ways. And that's why I consider it to be like advanced Jedi training for this time.
Very true. Yeah, thank you for saying that. And also mentioning doing things in the public eye. Obviously, I've had over, now 13 years of just doing films in the public eye. Before that, I was doing music. And talk about when you're doing films and you're speaking your mind and you are giving thoughts and concepts and philosophies out there, the audience, it seems like the ratio may fluctuate a bit, but there will always be what are known as haters and trolls. And in a way, I say that, also lovingly, but fair observation. There are always people who are just going to use the most hurtful ways of reflecting your work back to you. And it's difficult, and you're right, it is very much so Jedi mind tricks, or it's Jedi training in this new world. Like, how much do you believe what you're actually working on? And I found that, the plant medicines helped in this process of teaching me that I'm an artist. And so I'm not an academic. I'm not here to have more scientific knowledge than anyone. I'm not here to have a better and more fine-tuned philosophy than anyone. I'm not here to be the most devoted and religious to my path. I'm simply an artist. And what's beautiful about that is it liberates me to not have to be perfect. And so much in the public eye, we need to be perfect. And everybody that, like, if you're doing great, they love you. If you make the slightest little, even if you use the wrong language, or if you say, like for me at the beginning of my news, every now and then I would say, like, all right, guys, thank you very much. And I would get people saying, like, why just the guys? Why not the girls? And like, okay, fair enough. Obviously, I'm speaking to everyone listening, but you're right. That is a language thing. And so I found that, I don't have to be perfect. And when I make those mistakes, it could just roll right off, and all of however somebody wants to describe me back to me, it's gotten easier in that respect. But it doesn't mean that it's easy. And so I've really had to condition myself to take a look at all this as my training. When somebody is not being what I would say is, a good human being, and they are echoing back to me pure volatility and venom, then I've learned to separate myself just a little bit and implement in that little gap a question. Does this reflect me, or does this reflect the individual? And when I really answer that, at the end of the day, if I know I'm standing in my center and I'm doing what I love, then it changes my response. I don't seem to get so offended and, like, have to dig and harp on that. I can oftentimes just chuckle and say, thank you so much for your wisdom. Next, and just move on. And in a way, it's devaluing the amount of power and attention they want to harness by using such volatile words. So with that being said, one thing I also really love about what you're doing is to be able to speak more people's language. You're taking an academic approach. You're actually looking for higher education that will add to the credentials, which are part of the language of how to speak to people who are purely locked in the intellect. Maybe not all the time, but many people, that they need the scientific jargon said correctly before they will even consider your argument or your ideas and your concepts. So what higher education have you started to look deeper into? What are you pursuing now?
Yeah, right now I'm pursuing a master's in science in a program called Creativity Studies and Change Leadership. Now, studying creativity is a lot more challenging actually than, even I was really anticipating. So I also, my background, I have a degree in finance and entrepreneurship, and that was my undergrad. And it's been many years since I've gone back to school, but I felt really inspired by a couple of key papers that come out. And because, I am teaching frameworks that really weave together unique modalities together, that weave together Eastern philosophy and also quantum mechanics, although, we won't necessarily go down that rabbit hole, and also psychedelic science and research. And I think it's important to, have a strong base in a language that people can understand. I think we are living in this time where people really do still want, they feel better when you can cite the papers. And, especially in psychedelic science right now, it's like I won't say we, like I won't be so presumptuous to include myself into that research, but not yet anyways. But, there's still so much to discover, especially when we're talking about consciousness. So I do the best that I can. And really the impetus behind this pursuit is because I really want to change the narrative around creativity. I truly believe that we can learn to leverage psychedelics and sacred plant medicines to help us work with those windows of heightened mental flexibility and be able to learn cognitive tools and cognitive processes that allow us to literally find more solutions to the challenges that we face. And whether that's solving complex problems, or maybe that it's actually learning how to have a conversation with someone who you totally fundamentally disagree with without completely losing your shit. Like that's just as valid, I think, right now, especially, and so it was interesting. I was doing a lot of my own research. I really do well with self-directed forms of study, and I kept coming across different things that I was reading, like one IBM study that showed that the top 1,500 CEOs across companies across the world now call creative thinking the number one most important skill set, or mindset rather, to cultivate for the 21st century. And then I started reading about experts calling this a VUCA world. I mean, we don't have to look very far to see that this is a time marked by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And then I just kept working with the plant medicines from this perspective of noticing the way that the plants were helping me to think differently, to think outside the box, and then I just started going down this rabbit hole of making my own sort of connections to the research, because what's really interesting is when we look at what makes psychedelics so efficacious for the treatment of depression, those same neural underpinnings are also the same explanation for what helps psychedelics allow us to think more creatively. And so I came across a paper that Manesh Gurn and co-authored with a few other authors, including Robin Carrott-Harris. And Manesh is now a good friend of mine. And I'll leave him voice memos on WhatsApp being like, okay, this is how I'm talking about it. This is how I'm framing it. Like, am I portraying this accurately? And I think that it is important, to do our best. But it was really this paper that they wrote called Updating the Dynamic Framework of Thought, Psychedelics and Creativity, that was kind of like the linchpin that it was like, okay, I'm going to go back to graduate school and I want to be at the forefront of the next conversation in the psychedelic space. And there's not that many programs actually that focus on a master's in science, primarily in creativity and leadership. And the program is out of SUNY, State University of New York, and it's about 60 years old. It's the longest standing program. A lot of the founders of the creativity research and that movement were a part of that program in the beginning phases. And so I decided to do it, and I definitely have moments where I'm like, oh God, this is such a self-sacrifice, because I'm not the hugest advocate or fan of institutionalized education. But as I've expressed to you before, and you've heard me say before in the past, that, I want to legitimize this conversation. And I want a seat at the table. And I think that when we start talking about, optimal performance, creativity, flow states, psychedelics, there's not that many people in that niche, and it's very predominantly held by men. And so, for me, that was a big reason for going back to school. And I've been running retreats for about 10 years now. And I have this vision of like the next wave of retreats that I want to do, which is working with teams and corporate teams and incorporating psychedelics and plant medicines, and also teaching them these frameworks for creative problem solving. And that's one of the classes I just finished in the semester, was advanced creative problem solving facilitation for corporate teams. So, I'm learning tool sets and up-leveling all the time, in graduate school, but also self-taught all the time, reading books, watching webinars, signing up for weekend retreats that Gabor Mate is doing, for example, and looking at trauma and things like that weave into it, but that aren't my primary focus, for example.
I love that. What I actually really love about that, you're setting a different example. You're showing yourself as a different archetype for the academic community. And on top of that, you are also, you're breaking a part of a mold that I've seen inside much of, especially the older psychedelic community, coming from the 60s and 70s, which is, and not all of them, I have to say, because there were quite a few that, went from psychedelics directly into technology and computers. But for the most part, this kind of pushing out the business world and dropping out, as Timothy Leary might say. This whole idea that the two worlds, the entrepreneurial world and the psychedelic and the creative and the flow states and all those things have to stay separate. I feel like it's it's needed in a world where all solutions are inclusive. If we're going to have business, if we're going to have the monetary system, if we're going to have entrepreneurs, to in a sense integrate them, the prime players, into a more open-minded, a more everything that psychedelics seem to do. And it's not giving all the credit to psychedelics, but let's give a lot of credit to the plant medicines that have been used, especially traditionally, because even without the traditions, those that just were taking LSD made, in somebody's basement back in the 60s and 70s, even they, by and large, were saying it's connecting me back to nature. It's reminding me why we need to be good to Mother Earth, be good to one another. We are all a part of nature. And so it's really, it's not being exclusive, but very inclusive of all people. And this is really one of it's the epitome of Gnosticism. And Samael and Bior even spoke to it like, this is what a bodhicitta does. They don't stay in nirvana like this is bliss. I'm just going to stay in my own little, heaven bubble. Always enter myself back, not just to the places, but also in the circles of influence of people who need the medicine the most. And that's one thing that I really admire that you're doing, is you are self-sacrifice. As you said, you are stepping into an arena that is challenging, not just to be a woman, but also to have these kinds of ideas of open-mindedness, wanting to bring this kind of language deeper into the academic world. And I'm just so glad that I'm seeing psychedelics are being talked about in scientific circles now quite a bit more. You mentioned Robin Carhart Harris, and the individual who funded DMT Quest. The last documentary that I released with John Chavez was he funded as well Robin Carhart Harris's Imperial College London extended state DMT. Now, this isn't for pharmaceuticals, right? Extended state DMT is putting somebody in a DMT state for an extended period of time, not to see if it resolves intractable depression or OCD or any of these types of things. It's literally like, well, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that people on the DMT state are experiencing pan-dimensional entities. Let's see if we can keep them there quite a bit longer to see if we can engage in contact. This is Imperial College London we're talking about, and this is an actual study going. Like, the fact that we're talking about these things now, it shows that you really are on the right track. I'm really excited about that. And I guess to lead into the next question, what are your thoughts on, whereas a lot of people get into this, especially through the plant medicines, where they want to go back to nature, they want to run back to the way that things were, and they have this almost an inborn fear of and distaste of technology and modernization. Where do you land on that whole concept of, we have all this technology and infrastructure and we're in this modernized world? Where do you land in that whole argument?
Yeah, I think I can apply how I think about almost everything. I always ask myself, is this working for me or is this not working for me? And it's really simple. I think on a certain level, I wear an Aura ring. I know some people who got an Aura ring and they were like, oh my God, it's giving me anxiety. I'm like, take the damn thing off, like stop tracking it. So I think, and that's kind of how I think about like peak performance. And I think that there's, I think that there's such like an interesting sense of like self-criticalness, especially in Western culture. And it's like the subtle levels of just constant like self-harm. And that's why so much of the work that I do weaves in the path of the Bodhisattva, which, you touched on. I mean, Pema Chodron, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche is like, those teachings have profoundly changed my life. They've been like the primary roadmap I've used alongside the psychedelic experiences. I think that's so funny. I have this book on our podcast. You put up the Tao Te Ching, and I was like, oh yeah, this is my manual, the Shambhala, the sacred path of the warrior.
I love that.
And I've read this book like a million times. It's actually falling apart. And, but like with technology, it's like, okay, so I also have like this neurostimulation head device. I'm always like, let's play, what is this going to do for me? I'm super curious to learn. I've been playing with neurostimulation for probably about a year and a half now. I've become really good friends with Balder, Dr. Balder Onerheim, who is a neuroscience. He's a PhD neuroscience in creativity, and so also just super interesting. He's also just interested in his own exploration around microdosing and psychedelics. And so he created this company called Plato. It's Plato Science, and the device is called Plato Work. And they sent me one. So, and now I do affiliate for them. So in all like disclosure, but I've been enjoying playing with it. There's a couple of different settings, one of them, and it's based on the direction of current in the mind, in the brain. And, you're familiar with Stealing Fire and Steve Kotler and Jamie Wheel's book. And, they talk about some of the research with flow states that are induced by transcranial neurostimulation. And that's why I started getting kind of really interested in it. And I had another device and I was playing with that one, the Fisher-Wallace device. And then I found Balder's work, and they're just doing their own research right now, which they need to get like independent studies done. But I think a lot of the best research we can do is through self-reporting. That's also a lot of it with flow states. Is through years and years of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's research being done through self-reporting. So with this, I noticed that one of the settings, in particular, the concentration setting, that when I've for many years been cultivating practices with microdosing, combining microdosing with other modalities like breath work and movement and music and meditation and specific kinds of meditation that change our brainwave states that help us think more creatively. After I go through my my morning flow, I'll put this on. And I really do notice a difference. Like when I sit down to create, because we know flow follows focus. So with all the science that I talk about, it's like, how do we leverage understanding? And actually that's one of the reasons I found Balder, is because he wrote a journal, and he wrote a paper for Frontiers, which is, a very prestigious journal. And he found that if you teach people just the neuroscience part, like they looked at other studies about training for creativity, because we can train creativity. And I'll just say, all of us, most of us listening to this, whether you're listening to it live right now or in the future, we're all products of an industrialized education system that literally favors one way of thinking, what we call convergent over divergent thinking. And so Balder in this paper proved that, or demonstrated that by teaching people the underlying neurological mechanisms for which the brain works, that we could leverage that understanding to think more creatively. And that's really why I draw upon a lot of the science. It was like, okay, how can we understand the way that the mind works? So I get into also like the neuroscience of perception, for example. And there's no better way to study the mind than looking at a lot of the research that psychedelics are doing to discover how the mind works. So for this device, I track my own microdosing protocols, and I really encourage other people to do that too, if you really want to be your own sort of experimenter and scientist. And I really find that one of the settings in particular does really well. Flow follows focus. I do my whole morning flow routine, and then I put on this device for 25 minutes. I could sit down and write at the computer for like 3 hours nonstop, like just super focused. But I'm also setting up my environment. There's like, I think also this relationship to like discipline that people don't really love. And I heard Jason Silva talking about this on a podcast, because he's so into like flow states. And there's like a certain level of discipline that we can create in our lives to help us tap into flow. And I think, technology, that's also a good example of it. Like, not being ruled by your phone, being able to actually like put your phone down, have it so that you're not distracting yourself all the time. We've become so habituated towards distraction. So I think with technology, as much as you can make it work for you, better, why not? And if it's becoming an issue and a problem, like, look at that,
Yeah, you definitely make a really good point. A couple things I want to mention is I kind of feel like when we hop out of the fear, and especially fear led by ignorance, like, hearing a couple things about technology and then not really just going deeply through the thought experiment enough to realize that maybe sometimes it's not the technology doing these things to us, but, like we're holding a device all day long, and we're like, man, it's the technology company's fault that this thing has so much radiation, and like we don't realize that like we could also set the thing down. We could also walk outside. And I know in the near future, it's harder and harder to get away from all these towers. And when they're up in the satellites in the sky, this is a different conversation. But you're really mentioning that it is a part of our own discipline to understand, like, we do have a lot of agency in the matter of how we use technology. You just showed that head device that really enhances your way. This is a technology that enhances your innate understanding through your discipline of journaling of your own higher potential. And I think that's really beautiful. And then the discipline point is really amazing, because flow states specifically, Heart Math calls it coherence. And there's a couple different types of terms for it. But it seems to come more naturally and far more often in those who train. So let's say in basketball, who are the ones who experience the flow state most often in a high stakes, televised game? Are the ones who practice and have thousands and thousands of hours under their belt. They put in the discipline, they put in the time, and then flow states emerge a lot more seamlessly. If you have played maybe 5-10 hours of basketball, I guarantee you're not going to hop into a flow state as easily as somebody else. And if you do, you're not going to be performing some of the things that those who have put in the hours of time in there. So this is where it's really dynamic. The flow states can definitely bring us to our, I wouldn't say peak performance, but they could bring us to a high echelon of performance within us. But that doesn't mean it's the highest we could have with more training. And this is where you'll get into martial artists saying, you can practice a specific punch for 10, 15, 20 years, and there is no point in time where you ever say you have mastered the punch. You're always in a process of mastery. And so I guess the real beauty of this, and I want to actually ask something specifically about not just the technology that you just showed us, but I think the real beauty of it is to understand that we are living in a new world. This world is modernized. This world does have technology. It is available to us. So at least not being exclusive of certain things and having an open mind. That doesn't mean we have to have it in our company, but having an open mind towards some technology and not just placing all technology in this category of bad and anti-nature. I'm really excited to dive a little bit deeper into what technologies beyond what you've just shown do you really like? So that one specifically is neurostimulation, but we also talked before about biofeedback, correct? Could you just give a little the audience just a little bit of an understanding of what these differences are and what you can do with these technologies?
Yeah. I don't know if people could see that what I had my little gecko friend on my that's what I was showing you when I was like holding up my bottle. I have little geckos like hanging out with us for this conversation here. But yeah, technology, there's some great things that you can do with the Apple Watch these days. Just really simple. I think one of the biggest things is like having, if people need an anchor to help them reduce their stress levels, for example, that's really helpful. So when you start talking about biofeedback, we're looking at something that we're getting a visual cue. So if I'm wearing an Apple Watch, for example, and I'm watching my heart rate on my watch, and they have there's a range of different apps that you can use now, but one that comes with the Apple Watch is the breath app. And so it will expand in a visual diagram and then it contract. And so you breathe with it, for example, and you can also monitor your heart rate. So that's an example of biofeedback. Then we can go take it one step further and look at neurofeedback, which I don't do that much. I went and studied this week-long training program for neurofeedback, and the technology is actually still pretty expensive. There's something similar like the Muse headband. I don't actually have one of those. I've played with it before, and it was pretty cool, which isn't exactly measuring brainwave states, but more like mental activity. There is a little bit of a difference in the way that they describe that on their website. But technology like Apple Watch is really great. And you can use it also to help remind you to stand up more during the day. We know that chronic sitting is not good for us. So they have these like different things on there where it's like, okay, every so often it will say, I'll get a ding on my phone. And then it says like why don't you work standing up for a little bit or take 10 minutes to go walk? And that's also a really good differentiating factor between like active recovery and passive recovery. When we take breaks around like standing up and stretching the legs, not necessarily picking up the phone and scrolling Facebook, but just allowing the mind to wander. And so, again, weaving in other understandings of the way that we pay attention, the way we focus. We're very much so in a narrow focus, and this does relate to brainwave states. So many people are very familiar with, for example, the fight or flight response. And when we have this, activation of the fight or flight response, a lot of biological things and physiological things happen in the body. Our heart rate goes up, we start sweating, a lot of our blood flow moves to our extremities. So digestion shuts down. But another thing that happens that not many people are aware of is that our focus, our awareness narrows. So for example, if I'm walking on the path and I see a snake or something like that, boom, my awareness, my attention like hones in on the thing. And that has, again, it influences the rest of our biology. So one thing that we're not very aware of is that we're in narrow focus all of the time, which becomes detrimental. And so, Joe Dispenza teaches this meditation called his take on it is like the space meditation. I've gone way deep down the Joe Dispenza rabbit hole. He got that from a PhD, Les Femi, and you could read his book, The Open Focus Brain. It took me a while to actually find the source of this. And then I started really understanding like the neurofeedback research that Les Femi did. And he was one of the early pioneers of development of neurofeedback. And so for a couple of years, I was really training in these types of meditation techniques, one of them called open focus awareness. And the interesting thing I'll say is that so many of the modalities that I've learned, I actually first and foremost had these experiences directly with plant medicines. And then I would be like, oh, that's like EMDR, that's rapid eye movement, or, having these experiences of shaking and then learning about like the physiological benefits of shaking. And it was very similar with open focus awareness. Like I would have these experiences with plant medicines that was, and for those of you who have read Michael Pollan's book, he talks about this, referencing some other research around spotlight consciousness versus lantern consciousness. And if we were to look at this all on a Venn diagram, there's like really big overlaps between creativity, creative thinking, cognitive flexibility, how we pay attention, fluid states of mind, psychedelic experiences. So there's definitely like a lot of dots that we can connect here. But so all of this is to say that there are ways that we can focus our mind that we're really not trained to do. That's not part of, everyday sort of common conversation, and especially not what we learn as children in school. But if you are, for example, spending a lot of time on your phone, on your computer, working, it helps to just stand up and go outside and just open up your field of awareness. And if you were attached to neurofeedback, you would notice your brainwave states starting to go from beta into alpha. So I trained in these practices for some time, and then I actually went to a week-long training and hooked up my brain to, very complex brain mapping, and found that instantaneously I could use those techniques and drop into what's known as phase synchronous alpha. So moving from the beta into alpha bridge. And so, all of these things are connected. We're so like compartmentalized in the way that we think. But getting back to the Apple Watch with breathing and your heart rate, those are things that you can do direct biofeedback using technology. And you also don't necessarily need the technology. Sometimes it helps people because it creates a feedback loop where you're seeing your heart rate relax, so then it can further relax, and then you're calming down and activating your parasympathetic nervous system. And then using these other practices that are really simple, just noticing how you can open up your field of awareness, open up into more of like a peripheral view plane. And psychedelics actually kind of launch us into these experiences, what's known as lantern consciousness. Children are in lantern consciousness so much of the time. As we get older, we get more rigid. And maybe I'll just pause there because we could go off into that direction as around creative thinking, creative problem solving, and why psychedelics are so important for that. But that's just a little bit on the technology piece.
I love that. And, so I want to dive a little deeper into not having technology to have to be, a lot of us, when we use the word technology, most of us are talking about circuits and wires, plastic and metal and silicone. And what I really like are some of the more ancient and innate built-in technologies that we have. I've been studying a lot of darkness technology, going way, way, way back. And it seems like just as ubiquitous as psychedelic plant medicines are throughout history, and just as ancient is darkness technology, but also breath technology, and also mantra and singing and dance. And I was just reading, I'm forgetting his first name, Josh Nestor, his book Breathe. It might be Josh, but it's something Nestor. He was on Joe Rogan, I believe, but he's basically just going through all things breath. And in there, I was just reading it the other day, and he was talking about, he says that by humming, you actually release 15 times more nitric oxide in the nasal cavity just by humming. And I'm thinking, well, chanting, and what that's doing is that's us it's good for the vagal tone, the vagal nerve. And releases nitric oxide, 15 times more nitric oxide inside the nasal cavity. And that's a vasculature dilator, and, has so many benefits for certain times and certain periods. And I want to really just dive into what are some of the techniques that are free to everybody. If there's somebody who's like, I don't have $2 to spend on anything, so give me something free that I can do that can help me if I'm having an anxiety attack, or if I want to increase mental alertness or focus. What are some of the things that you really use that are just innately available to all humans?
Yeah, I mean, breath, we could go down such a rabbit hole, and I'm still learning so much from other people too, especially Wim Hof. And speaking of like the ventral vagal nerve, which is part of the vagus nerve. When we do tone, that is really helpful for that. And so is putting your face in cold water. So I definitely notice, and movement and high intensity movement. And that's another way that you can use technology or not. You could use a heart rate monitor to get yourself in that zone that's really pushing your edge. And also, I don't know, does this count of technology? But like my jam spot for like activating my mental state is movement combined with music that just is like really inspiring me, so breath work, cold exposure, cold therapy is amazing. And sometimes if you don't have a cold plunge, even just putting some ice in a bowl of water and putting your face in that, I really find that's very effective. Again, open focus awareness is a specific kind of technique that also helps. It actually helps treat PTSD and anxiety. And again, because the way that we're focused is also related to so many other, so many other physiological aspects of ourselves, and so is the breath, and so a lot of those things like the chanting and the singing and a lot of the vagus nerve toning is also helping us to become more resilient as well. And that looks at heart rate variability. We could also measure heart rate variability with those are other pathways that we could take the conversation. But yeah, I would say, breath is key. I haven't done the darkness yet. And I just had a friend who I think I was telling you about, Ben. His name's Robbie. He came out of 10 days in the darkness, and he's still kind of reintegrating. So we haven't really talked yet, but I'm really excited for you guys to connect too, because he's also has an amazing company called Inner Breathwork, and he's a breathwork facilitator, and you guys have to check out this website. Is amazing.
I can pull it up.
Gosh, yeah, I can also send you guys a link. We're just setting up this. I'm just becoming an affiliate for them because I really just love the work that they're doing. It's called Inner Breathwork, and it's beautiful. They have all these videos, and it's a monthly membership and all sorts of different kinds. Yeah, is that no, that's not it. Here, it's called Inner. Here, let me look it up.
That sounds really interesting. Just while you're looking it up, I just want to say that yes, movement and listening to your favorite music is a technology. Think of shamanism. Shamanism is a technology, and they integrate the use of specific plants in a very specific set and setting with aromas, with a certain lighting, things on the walls, symbols, chanting, music. They'll even like shake a palm rattle around you. There's all these different things, and that would be called an integrative technology. So breath is we would call it a simple technology, even though it's pretty complicated if you look at it in a specific way. But yes, that's a technology, and I think that's beautiful. I actually, for a lot of my clients, I'll tell them to get a very specific DVD, and it's a concert by Krishna Das. And I tell them for 21 days, listen to watch this entire concert, dance with it, sing the mantras, and if and when you feel so moved, just stop dancing and just shake and tremor. And for 21 days, I've noticed every single person has come back to me and they're like, this is mind-blowing how much every one of them has this emotional breakdown where they cry, and it's like some kind of emotional release where they tap back into ancient trauma. So yes, that is a technology, and thank you for bringing that up.
I just posted. Posted in the chat. Okay. Inward breathwork. Yeah, and there's a
TRE by chance, the tension releasing exercises or trauma releasing exercises. It's very similar to what you're referring to.
Yeah, I am familiar with them, and then there's also like a lot of specific practices that you can. That happens when we co-regulate with other people's nervous systems. This is part of Porges polyvagal theory, so being able to, and that's a big part of therapy and the therapeutic work that, psychedelic assisted therapy works with, is like how to co-regulate and create safe space for people to re-experience some of the trauma that they experienced. And I'll just say, trauma is not my primary wheelhouse, so I don't want to speak to anything that is that I don't feel like so confident in saying. I'm not a therapist, and so I just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah, so it's beautiful, the entrainment of, there's so many ways we can look at it, the EKG, the EEG, But everything that I've read that has to do with psychoneuroimmunology, with Michael Winkelmann taking a look at shamanism and the reason for in peyote ceremonies, in iboga ceremonies and ayahuasca ceremonies, there's a group of people and they're all in a form of medicine that allows them to be a little bit more suggestible or a lot more suggestible. And there are certain things setting a rhythm, like a rattle. There's music, especially in iboga or iboga. It's polyrhythmic. And so you can entrain to many different rhythms at once. And what I love about this is that, even when we're talking about shaking and tremoring, I was watching this movie just this morning. It's called The 12. And I won't get into all the nuances of it, but it was showing a lot of ancient traditions. And there was this one from Asia called Tin Shen or Shen Tin. And it's a form of martial arts, but they do this in groups where they will actually, grab onto each other's they'll grab onto each other's shoulders and make like a train in a big circle, and they'll just be hopping up and down around in circles, holding on to one another. And I was like, wait a minute, I've seen that in Africa. And so I went and I took a look at this thing in Africa where there were a lot of like just indigenous dances, and they'd be dancing, holding one another, hopping up and down. And then there's this amazing movie back in the day, I think it was back in the 70s, called Dance in Human History. And it takes you through all the different forms of indigenous dance and how it represents the elements in the environment that they're around. But the most beautiful thing about it was you could take an individual through all these kinds of movement modalities, but when you take people in groups through these movement modalities, it actually seems to, in every single one of the ones that I was at least able to find literature on or speak to people about, when you have many people doing the same thing, it actually enhances everybody who's involved, their own experience. So if they're not breaking through, somebody else having a breakthrough in that very experience can help guide them into their own breakthrough. Because sometimes people aren't breaking through because they don't feel comfortable, even when no one's watching, because they feel like they're watching and they don't want to look stupid even to themselves. This is how psychologically blocked we can get. So I find that beautiful, especially doing these things in group settings. And I guess this brings me to a point that even community is a technology. It really is. There's so many ways of going about it, but, one of the best technologies to utilize is a loving and caring community that can cultivate a form of a sacred space and holding space for one another. And I would really love for you, I think you'd be very, eloquent at speaking to this. What is holding space? We hear this a lot, but what does that mean, holding space? And maybe give a couple examples, like when you're just trying to hold space for your child or your lover to go through whatever they need to go through, or somebody that you don't even know on the street. Maybe give a couple examples to kind of flesh out, what does that mean to hold space for someone?
What a good question. I really love that question. I think it's a certain way of embodiment, is getting into a very coherent state of mind-body alignment, mind-body synchrony. And so I think the work of Pema Chodron and her teachers and that lineage of the way of the Bodhisattva has really influenced my perspective and perception of what it means to hold space. And you said bodhicitta earlier. I think you meant to say bodhisattva, but the practice of bodhicitta is the primary practice of the bodhisattva. And so bodhi means awakened or enlightened. The Buddha was awakened under the Bodhi tree, and chitta means heart, but it also means mind. So, and that's really something very interesting to note about different languages, right? Different languages from different cultures point to different things. And this word chitta, C-I-T-T-A, points to almost heart mind as if one thing. And so the way that I just relate to this notion of space holding, and this is kind of also how I relate to this like Jedi training for the 21st century, for warriors on the Heart Tribe, is like how, and this is, so much easier said than done, because the definition of somebody who is like completely open heart, open mind. Someone comes to you and they say something and you centralize around self. It's like that pre-verbal contraction. If someone says, like, oh, you did that thing, that was whatever. And it's like this experience of visceral contraction. And so the practice of the Bodhisattva is cultivating this practice of bodhicitta, which is actually takes a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of willingness. It's like lifetimes of practice, because those habitual responses to shutting down it's just so deeply ingrained in us. It's like that knee-jerk reaction to contract. And when we contract, we actually create separation. And so the way that I think about space holding is staying open, and that's really also like the definition, this notion of wide open mind, wide open heart, in the face of adversity, in the face of pain, in the face of suffering, and we get to know those places, those dark places very, very intimately, especially when we work with, plant medicines and psychedelics. And that's why it's the path of the warrior. It takes a lot of compassion and willingness to stay open without centralizing around self, without being afraid of it's like watching someone drowned in the ocean. And then like we practice swimming so that we can help those people who are also not making it through right now. But if we just become so afraid, then we're not going to be a help to anyone. If we also jump in and drown, we're not a big help to anyone. So this notion of space holding, to me, and this is probably going to be a very different answer than, anyone else that you ask. It's this notion of like really tuning into this sense of open quality of heart and open quality of mind. And I think that's really important for community, especially because when we know, it's our family, it's our closest friends, our closest loved ones that like we have the potential to hurt us the most when they give us a reflection that doesn't feel good, or, when challenges are coming, you want to get real close to someone, like just live in community with them, and see all those parts. And so the space holding is this capacity to take our seat, and that's a metaphorical training, and it's also a physical real training. And we train in taking our seat and staying centered. And Chogyam Trungpa says, strong back, open front. Strong back, we're embodying this sense of dignity, and we embody this sense of dignity, and then we hold space and send a signal through many different ways, seen and unseen, vibration, frequency, entrainment, but also through very subtle visual cues. And we give other people permission to embody their center, their sense of dignity, and to communicate from that place. And of course, when we start going into space holding, we are literally creating a very strong container, a strength, an energetic field where, and sometimes like I'll hold space for people when I do deep solo dives with the medicine. I'm space holding for all the people I'm working with right now, and they're not even in my physical space, but I can feel it. I can feel the energy of that. And, when we start looking at, going down the quantum rabbit hole of entanglement and Rupert Sheldrake's work, and, some of the research that Lynn McTaggart has done, we know that our thoughts and that we are essentially like these antennas that influence our reality around us. And so space holding for me is like really getting into that integrated mind-body alignment so that our signal, our channel is very clear. The space is very clear. It's not like this staticky quality of like chaos. It's more synchronous. And we create that space by the way that we choose to show up in mind, body, heart synchrony, if that makes sense.
It does. And I really appreciate that. In fact, it really makes me want to ask this this next question specifically to you. The very next question I'm going to get into after that is really more centered around humility. And I only want to mention that now because I feel a beautiful sense of humility in you and the way you speak about these things. But before I even ask that question, I want to ask, with what you just said, in a world where we can say like, okay, I have my own tribe, and then there's community, and then there's the world. And, I kind of feel like whether we like it or not, we're all in some kind of tribe. We're all on some kind of, spaceship together, if you will. And in a world where we're not just contending with, well, if you don't like these people, you can move away from them. There's this ideology that seems to be colonizing the place, and Mother Nature, by and large, seems to be paying a terrible price. How much of a price she's paying, again, there's still some arguments and debates, but the fact that there are a lot of people that can simply just tune out of the bigger picture and the bigger ramifications of all of our little actions, like what we put our dollar towards, how we treat the person next to us, not thinking that it may ripple out to the people they know and then the people they know. I guess my question is, how do we not even hold space, but what do you feel like the right space within being authentic to ourselves is in a world out there? Is it true all we need is love, sweet love? You just love one another and that'll solve all the problems? Or is there real intervention that needs to happen? Or is there something in between the two? Because this is what a lot of people are facing right now. Everyone, like you said in the beginning, we're so polarized. So how do we address the polarization without taking on a side or without condemning another side, but to literally hold space for what seems to kind of need to happen and parse out what doesn't need to happen? And do we just allow it, being like, oh, well, even if we destroy the planet, it's all just one big learning lesson? Or is there intervention? Do you get where I'm going with this?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think, oh gosh, it's so interesting because this comes up with my clients so much, and a lot of times I'll hear clients say like, okay, well, this person at work is doing this thing, or my husband or my wife is doing this thing. And I think that there's not a place for relationship intervention, coming together, for example, but there's so much work to do before even getting there. And I think that this time, and what this time is really asking of us, is to get right with ourselves. And I really think that that's the invitation for, talk about technology. Plant medicines are a powerful biotechnology. And I think what they're really doing is extending a hand inside, allowing us to come within ourselves. I actually recorded a whole solo podcast episode on this notion called Truth, Triggers, and Getting Right with Yourself. And I'm coming out of a 10-year-long marriage, and we're transitioning pretty good out of it, and we definitely have our stuff. And a few months ago, I was talking to a mutual friend, and I was like, but he's doing this thing and he's not seeing it this way. And it's like, it's like we can practice all the time in this notion of acceptance and compassion. But then when it's really close to home, it's like so hard. Like, no. But like, he really is doing the thing that is like, driving me crazy. And my friend on the phone was just like, girl, the only thing you need to do right now, the only thing anyone needs to do is get right with yourself. And that night I ended up doing a really deep solo dive with the medicine, and the medicine was just like on point. Like and it was such a big transformational shift. And I find that every time I just look at like, okay, where am I out of integrity? Like, where am I out of alignment? Like, how can I show up better aside from that person over there and them, and like wanting to, like, even how can I change my own narratives so that this dynamic doesn't drive me totally fucking insane? Like, how do I actually just like get into that place? And this isn't about condoning abuse or, allowing people to walk all over you. And I think that this is where this notion, like Chogyam Trungpa's teachings, comes in so much, because this notion of strong back, open front is not, it's like we can be strong and kind. We can be, set clear boundaries and communicate those clear boundaries with kindness and compassion and gentleness. And that's what I'm talking about with Jedi training. Like, that's the path of mastery, not completely losing our shit the moment that someone like says something to you, and it goes in both ways. It might be self-criticism, and that's that notion of being knocked off center, you know. So when we take our seat, we're coming in this notion of center. Someone criticizes you and it's like boom, off center. But then maybe someone praises you and it's like, ooh, ego puffing up, like chest puffing up. Like that's also kind of off center from a different perspective. And so I just think the medicine that, and then I'm not even saying like, oh, Ben, this is your medicine or yours. And like anyone listening, like you have to get right with yourself, because even that, right? Like see how fast that could go spiral. But it's for me, like that's my medicine right now, is like, how do I get right with myself? How do I learn to have more self-compassion, more understanding for and care for my body, my heart, my mind? Where am I out of alignment? You know, I could talk about like all the ways that I am like so spiritual. I'll spend 20 minutes on the phone with AT&T customer support. I lose my shit every time. You know, like, I mean,
real test.
it's the real test. Like just, you know, 30 minutes in on any level of a conversation with AT&T support, and I'm like, wow, you know, someone needs to like record this and like call me on my shit. And I think that that's just, you know, it's also a sense of relaxing into how human we all are. And we can zoom out when you're like, well, what about the planet? It's like when you zoom out and look at the birth cycle of one universe till, you know, the Big Bang, because now we know, based on what we know with quantum physics, it's going to completely collapse on itself at some point, or that's what the theory is. And then it, you know, expands again and births another universal life cycle. And in this like trillions and trillions and trillions of years, like human life, like life, let alone human life, is just such a small fraction of that. And I think plant medicines also help us see just like the bigger picture. We want to take things so seriously. It's so important, and it is important. You know, life, like this is important. This is like an incredible opportunity. And also like hold it lightly. Like we don't need to like grip the shit out of everything all the time. You know, we could just like loosen the grip. And I know how hard it is to do that on a continual moment by moment basis.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, you know, it was a wise man who once said the deeper you look into the nature of reality, you'll always come to the same understanding, and that is never go with AT&T. So that's one thing. Beyond that, I guess what I want to say is there's something in there that you already mentioned about humility. But I was thinking about humility when we were talking about technologies and, you know, darkness being a technology. And some would say that's not a technology. It's just, you know, a phenomena that happens. Right. But some people don't use darkness as a form of awakening consciousness, and other people do use darkness as is the same thing with breath. So it really is a technology. And humility, I really want to ask what your thoughts are on how what might be a good definition of humility, and how might we use that to deepen our spiritual practice. You've already kind of touched upon that in the last answer, but I really want to focus on like, what is humility, and why is it important, maybe more important now, if I could be so bold as to say now in history, we need humility more than many other of these tools that we've accessed.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question, especially, yeah, this notion of humility. I mean, admitting when you're wrong, admitting that you don't have all the answers. You know, like I do not have all the answers, and I'm still figuring out so much stuff. And I do, you know, have moments where I'm like, okay, you know, I can own this, and I feel confident in this, and other places where I just genuinely don't. And, you know, there's a lot of vulnerability in that, in communicating that. But I think, you know, I kind of want to take this in like a slightly like different direction. Is that, you know, one of the things that makes psychedelics and plant medicine so amazing is that they help to loosen our sense of me and story of I and sense of self-identity. And I think that that's one of the things that we're all defending so like for dear life, you know. And this is like the path of the Bodhisattva, the Buddhist teachings. It's like the such a big part of those teachings around how, and Chogyam Trungpa talks about this with like that soft spot. Like we have this soft spot because we don't want to admit that we're also transient and impermanent and that our lives are going to come to pass. And we are always kind of trying to hold on to this solid sense of ground and look for something to hold on to. And we do that by attaching ourselves to things and to people and places, but also to our sense of rightness and our sense of identity. And we build these whole ego constructs around, this is who I am. Yeah. This is my sense of I, and and we build whole entire storylines around that. And psychedelics are one way that really do help us sort of like loosen that grip just a little bit, just enough so that we can say, maybe I'm not that thought, maybe I'm not that belief. And that does really require a lot of humility, and I've had a lot of moments like really bowing at the altar of my own life, and really offering my life up of like, okay, I don't know if I'm going to have any real influence here on this planet, but like, what else am I going to do with my life, And I do think that there's this, I think we're all being really called to face this sense of humility of like letting go of rigid ways of perceiving, rigid ways of thinking, and rigid ways of saying like, this is who I am. I'm a left wing, or I'm a, right wing, or like whatever it is. And, loosen that grip a little bit so that we can actually move through this time and, like hopefully find and really birth a more harmonious chapter of human history. And I think that the only way we're going to make it through this gap, of this time of tumultuous transition is if we all find a little bit more humility. And, okay, so I launched the Psychedelic Leadership Podcast like a month after this whole thing with like the cancel culture, and then I hosted like the first Clubhouse room calling like Psychedelic Leadership. And I was so afraid to step out with this name, Psychedelic Leadership. And, because like, who am I to like call myself a psychedelic leader, even though actually most people don't know that the real like intention behind launching with that name was looking at how psychedelics can help us become better leaders in regardless of what domain. A lot of people see psychedelic leadership and they're like, oh, my market are like people stepping into the psychedelic space. And even that can take a myriad of forms, whether it's like an integration coach or a microdosing coach or a guide or a shaman. I mean, so many different ways, musician, entrepreneur, investor. But it can also, my original thought was like looking at the research around how psychedelics point towards greater empathy, towards greater cognitive flexibility, creativity, enhanced pro-social behavior, lower attachment to financial wealth. I mean, these are, a recent study just showed that a huge population sample that psychedelic users are overall generally healthier than non-psychedelic users. There's less abuse in the household. Less authoritarian political views. So I was really looking at that, and one huge research paper to cite was Roland Griffith's work that they did with psilocybin to show that one psilocybin journey can fundamentally alter someone's personality trait known as openness to experience. And as we get older, we become more rigid in the models of reality, these belief systems that we have. And this also points to some of the work that Robin Carhart Harris did with the Rebus model, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. And so I was really actually looking at like, wow, psychedelics, like the future of leadership is like psychedelic leadership. Like, oh, okay, that makes so much sense. And then, I got this email from someone after I hosted like the first psychedelic leadership room on Clubhouse. And he was like, you need to humble yourself. Like, he was like, you are not humble. And I was just like, damn, like when I launched the whole thing, I mean, it was like months of like inner process of like, oh my God. And like, how am I, like, people are going to perceive me. And like, every time I host a panel with experts, I'm like, wow, I really don't know anything. And like, I would have these like really kind of low moments and then, get an email like that from someone being like, you need to humble yourself in front of the plants. And I'm like, brother, man, only you knew like how much I've had my ass kicked by plants on this path. And, I mean, we just got to do the best we can to like stay true to what we're here to do. And,
Well,
but I think this word humility is being thrown around a lot too, like through the social justice words. It's like, you need to be more humble. And it's like, well, can you say that a little more kindly?
And humble.
Yeah. There's hypocrisy is very rampant right now. And I mean, I immediately think of Graham Hancock saying we are a species with amnesia. And it seems like we are at this precipice point where at one, there seems like there's one end of the spectrum where there's this purging going on with a lot of people having this cognitive dissonance and having to face some things that are very uncomfortable. And at the other end, there's a lot of people who are trying to hold space, but also saying like, I'm ready whenever you are, I've got patience of virtue, but it's a spectrum, and I think that's part of all of this. I know in my own personal encounters, I've had to learn to understand, meet them where they're at and understand everyone's at a different stage, but, don't shame or judge them. I was at that stage once, but just first acknowledging what stage am I talking to this person at?
Yeah. There's there's this thing where we use tactics and we don't realize that we're using tactics. Our subconscious, when we're feeling good about ourselves and we think that the world is completely wrong, we use the tactic of extremism. We'll say something extreme because we are so certain that we're right and what we're seeing is wrong. And that's kind of what's super interesting is, a lot of the times I really consider just going into fiction writing because a lot of times I'm not even really trying to prove something. I want to open people's minds to a possibility that what we're actually experiencing is something akin to rapture. And in the idea of the rapture, it's not just the idea that, or more or less, I'll say it this way, like the apocalypse, because the actual apocalypse is the lifting of a veil. And what I kind of feel that technology is helping us do, it's not happening overnight, but it's happening in a slower rolled out process, is the loss of a certain form of privacy and the permanent recording of much of our actions and behaviors. And most of us don't even realize that when you have your phone near you, you're being recorded. And this isn't to get into conspiracy. This is just knowing that data companies are doing this. And without faulting them for it, the first thing I want to say is, can we just move past the I wonder if it's really happening or not and just pretend that it is happening and pretend that technology is becoming more ubiquitous and everything is becoming recorded? And if we were to see how we behave in our weakest moment, in our most angry moment, in our most violent moment, if we were to perceive ourselves as we're in a different state and we're not identified with who we're yelling at or whatever's going on, but we just see the behavior, and our soul can reckon with us in that moment and say, now, was this in alignment? Yeah. I think we would acknowledge that much of the way that people in cancel culture and in the world right now, as we're saying, it's so divided and polarized, we are acting a certain way. We are behaving a certain way. And humility is the first thing that seems to go out the window when we think we are so right. And a lot of the times, if you look back at colonization, if you look back at some of the most egregious things that have ever happened, the first thing that goes out the window is this idea that maybe I'm wrong, because when we think we're just absolutely right and these people are in the wrong, then we are willing to justify some of the most hideous forms of violence upon others because we just know for a fact that God is on our side and we are right. So the point that I'm kind of driving at is I almost feel, without having to prove that I think this theory is correct, I almost feel that we are experiencing this lifting of a veil where almost all of our deepest, darkest secrets are eventually going to be out there for everyone to see. And we may need to, whether this be a spiritual or a technological or a combination of the two, we're going to have to reckon with everything that we've done and the way that we've behaved around other people, the words that we've said. And there's something interesting about psychedelics and plant medicines, if done correctly, is they will show us these things.
Oh, yeah.
Plant medicines have shown me every harsh word I've ever shared, but from the receiving end. And I'm like, oh, my heart aches because words are so powerful, and words stick around more than a smack in the face will, you know? And so I guess, like, you know, as we're kind of, you know, wrapping this up into a big old bundle for the audience to understand, I would really love for you to touch upon, and, you know, some kind of kernel of wisdom. And humility was something I was driving at, but some kind of kernel of wisdom for those who want to understand the way they are on the inside. And maybe they want to even approach psychedelics and plant medicines, but they're afraid. Everyone that I've ever talked to that are afraid to even touch psychedelics, the number one thing I always hear is, I'm afraid of losing control. And my question is always like, have you ever asked yourself what you think you have control over? And go through a little thought experiment. But I want to hear from you. When you deal with people who are wanting to know thyself a little more, and plant medicine seems to be the path that they're looking to take, but they're afraid, what process do you help them through so they can access this medicine without it being a terrifying experience and they just never touch it again?
Oh, I mean, that's a really hard question. That's really tough because, I mean, first of all, I recommend, if you are the type of person who is feeling called to plant medicines, but you are afraid, I definitely recommend working with someone, like work with a guide. You know, things have changed so much. Like, even like the whole cultural narrative around psychedelics is completely changed. In some ways, it was kind of nice, like before the cat was out of the bag, because we just like did a bunch of psychedelics and did like really crazy shit. And we like never even really thought about it. You know, we were just like, oh yeah, of course we want to take 3 hits of acid and go like surf 20-foot waves. Like, no, I'm kidding. That's like the best thing we can possibly imagine, you know? And now it's like very like controlled and like, you know, I'm like, okay, I appreciate that. So the other thing I would say, you know, around this notion of people, like I mean, microdosing is a great way to start and cultivating a relationship. And some people, you know, I work with people who are new to microdosing because they're just like, okay, how do I work with these in a way that can help me? And then maybe you like work up towards what's known as like a threshold dose, where it's like just in that level of perceptual awareness. Like, there's nothing saying that like you need to go out and go for like a heroic dose and eat like 7 grams of mushrooms, you know. Go on like with a good recommendation with someone that you know will hold good space, because this is even a huge conversation now, you know, like especially people are like, I want to go for like an authentic experience in Peru, and like a lot of people have very traumatic experiences down there. So, you know, do your due diligence and vet the people that you're going to work with. You might want to consider microdosing is a great option, or having sort of like quote unquote, you know, like easeful journeys where it's like in the setting, you know, with people that you know. And I don't want to say like recreational, because, you know, like everyone's like poo-pooing recreational psychedelic use these days, but I'm like, wow, it really can have like a very valid place, I think, you know, in terms of people's like shifting the way that, you know, it's great to be with an eye mask and noise canceling headphones, but then there's also a benefit, I think, of like being outside and like seeing reality differently, you know, whether it's out in nature or, you know, at the beach. Don't go surfing, but, you know, it's like being out like in nature. I mean, we used to do crazy shit. We used to like go and like motorbike around Thailand and like, you know, all the crazy things.
I'm in.
But, and it was just different. It was just different days, you know? But I think microdosing is a great way. And then the other like most important thing I would say is like try to change out the word control for influence in your vocabulary. Like, how can I show up and influence, you know, intentions, set and setting? You know, everyone talks about set and setting in like the psychedelic space. And yes, it's so important because everything is amplified, but your set and setting is still important in like a microdosing space and in your like everyday reality. You know, it influences us. We're just exposed to like what's amplified in the psychedelic space, which makes a good case for why we should like really create the foundation of our lives to be very conducive and supportive to like emotional and physical and mental health and well-being, which is a whole other topic. But influence, how do we show up in influence with the way that our mindset is going into a journey, the way that, and I feel like that's been such a big key shift for a lot of people who do have control issues, where they're like, oh my God, I'm going to lose control. And it's like, well, what about like the way that you sit can influence the way that you're experiencing your journey right now? Or what about the way that you breathe can influence how you're processing your emotion? And I think that that's been a really big key, like pivotal piece for a lot of people who like quote unquote work with control issues.
I really like that. And you're definitely right about the recreational thing. I feel like it's easy and it's okay, just acknowledging it. It's okay that certain things have their dogmatic moments. Right now, we as the psychedelic community seem to, like, as you say, we poo-poo the recreational. And it has its place because, for the most part, there is a lot of harm that can come from just taking a bunch of hits of acid and going to a heavy metal concert, or, something that just, it doesn't jive, and we don't realize the full impact of what we're doing on our psyche. But then there are those moments where, man, I mean, like, I'm so glad that I actually started doing psychedelics, when I was 14. It kept me out of opiates, which all my friends were getting into. It really kept me from going down rabbit holes that a lot of other people did. I realized that there was this like opening of consciousness rather than a shutting down or a dimming of what I feel, such as alcohol and opiates and things like that. And all of my experiences throughout my teens were absolutely incredible. I wasn't doing completely stupid things. For the most part, it was always in nature. We would have bonfires. I was always careful around the fire. We'd have music. It was always really amazing music. We'd be singing. So recreational, you're right. It has gotten a tarnished name. And I think there definitely is a place for that. And what that is not having to be so dogmatic. Whereas, like, no, if you're going to take plant medicines, you need to do it in some, quote unquote spiritual setting. You need to have rattles. You need to have Icaros on the wall. You need, like, no, like we don't have to get dogmatic with it. Like, understand set and setting. And that will, for the most part, really alleviate things that, that don't need to be a contender in the psychedelic experience. But I guess the main thing, and I guess the last thing that I really want to get into, is this concept of shame coming from potentially prohibition and our parents telling us that, even cannabis, a drug is a drug is a drug. You're altering your consciousness. That's a drug. And, you're not allowed to. And so there was this entire several decades where children who wanted to experiment with consciousness, which it always seems to happen, there are always those children, are having to hide it. And they're hiding it not just with this glorious attitude, but with shame and with guilt. And so I really want to ask your thoughts on those who have come from those generations, where parents said, like, no, this is bad, it's wrong, they are narcotics, they are illegal, if you do it, you're going to get in trouble, it's going to lead to worse things in your life. All of those words, also, it creates this mental model that we are doing something wrong. Talk about bad mental, our mindset. So I guess as a last question, I really just want to gauge how you work with people who might have inbuilt shame or guilt around using these medicines. Like, how much does that actually come up, and how do you engage with that?
The era of this is your brain on drugs with the frying pan. Yeah. Well, first of all, I just don't think that we, and just kind of linking to what we were talking earlier with the cancel culture and all of that, like, we don't grow through shame. Like, we cannot grow through shaming each other. And that's not where growth is going to happen, in my opinion. I honestly don't see it almost at all in the work that I do with people. I feel like I've been, sort of immersed in the psychedelic space for so long, comes up every once in a while, but I would say like it's actually been amazing to see, even just in the past few years. It's kind of like an exponential curve happening right now, where for like the last decade it was kind of going at a slow pace, but now, more than anything, I think that we are at a full on past the tipping point of people being more open and seeking out psychedelic experiences than ever before. And that's coming with its own set of, stuff that we really need to be aware of. But I would say, like, surprisingly, it's very rare. I'm also just not interacting with the people who do have a lot of like the self-shame around it, just because, a lot of people that reach out to me and a lot of the communities that I'm immersed in have been working with plant medicines for so long. And the people who reach out to me already have like a sense of openness to work towards that. But I would just say, just like kind of alongside working with shame and humility was something that like you really put on the table. I would say like the other really big thing to put on the table here is training in letting go, and I pointed to that like a number of times, just around, the sense of like identity in our belief systems. And maybe it's a belief that like this is bad. And that also influences the larger set and setting, like if you go into a trip with like the belief system that this is wrong or bad, it's very likely that mindset is also going to influence, the outcome or your experience of it. A lot of people move out of like religious dogma through their psychedelic, passage portals, and like those journey ways like allow them to really let go of some like really big predetermined belief systems and structures that they were raised with. And so I wouldn't say like I see it like a huge amount, but I would just say, really like this is the time for us to choose what's right for all of us, and at this point, like we can't deny the research. I mean, there's been so much research, and that's kind of like a full circle moment with looking at the beginning of the conversation. Like I had an opportunity to interview Kevin from the Horizons conference and in Clubhouse. And it was so interesting. He said, if you're a leader in the psychedelic space, you're not even really talking about psychedelics and depression anymore. He's like, there's so much evidence for that. Like, that's like old news, Yeah. You're talking about like psychedelics and creative problem solving, and like looking at actually like what is next? How can we leverage these experiences to help us solve like some of the most complex challenges we face? As Einstein said, we can't solve our problems at the same level of thinking that created them. And I do think that psychedelics help us think bigger. So if anyone is working with shame, like maybe there's like that experience of moving through that experience with psychedelics to let go of that, to think bigger, to give us a different perspective. That is the basis of cognitive flexibility, looking at something from a different angle, and then having to do the work in the body, to let go of that, of the sort of like stored structures in the body that, we are what we believe, and our body and our mind are so connected. And so we do have to do that work of letting go of shame on the body level too. But, there's so much I could say about this notion of like, this is the era of letting go. And I really believe that, like a central theme for us at this time is like really learning how to let go and push off the shores of safety, and find ourselves and teach ourselves how to swim right now.
I love that. That's such a powerful message right there. Really, especially when you said like working with that feeling of shame, not avoiding it, not neglecting it, trying to pretend like it's not there, or just saying, well, I don't want to dive into any methodology that might put it right in my face. But instead, no, it's there, get comfortable with it, ask it some questions. I had a client before ask me, what do I do about this nagging pain that I have? I've gone to doctors and, I've tried different functional movement and stuff like that, and I can't figure it out. I'm trying to get rid of it. And I said, listen, I don't know how to answer this, specifically without actually working with you for a while. But before you try and get rid of it, have you thought of ever sitting with it in meditation and asking it what message it has for you, instead of treating it like like something that has nothing to offer and you just want to throw it away the first chance you get. You just need to figure out its problem and destroy it. What about asking it some questions, seeing these things as potential lessons and learning experiences? And that in and of itself was a paradigm shift. And I've connected with him, since then, and the pain hasn't completely gone away, but it has allowed for him to find a way deeper into the pain without shaming it, without even being like, this is something I need a body worker to work it out or something like that. It's actually what psychologically might it be coming from. So I love that you mentioned it like that. And really, I think that was such a beautiful way. This is an era of letting go. We really do seem to be in an era that is burgeoning, where a lot of people are, we're showing what it is we would love to get rid of without even realizing it. It's coming to the surface. And I think that is actually a very valuable time to use our creativity to say, okay, instead of when it gets volatile, going back into war mode, how can we actually utilize all this energy and pivot in a different direction that seems to be more solution oriented than more, causing or adding more harm and trauma to the whole situation. So, I guess what I would really like to say is I love what it is that you're bringing, not just to the psychedelic community, but really I've been very deeply in human potential and understanding human potential. And in my show Limitless on Gaia, the very last episode was the bigger picture, realizing that human potential, I don't believe it ends with little old me. I think our higher potential exists just in the very next step up in our community, and then beyond that in the world at large. Our higher potential doesn't, or it definitely extends into nature, and who knows where beyond that. So I really love what you're bringing, and I want to make sure that the entire audience knows how to access what it is that you're bringing to humanity right now in human potential. We got your website. Excited about.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for that invitation. So my home base is livefreelaurad.com. And I have a couple of, if people are new to microdosing, and I'll just say, psychedelics and microdosing aren't for everyone. This is like, we also have to use that discernment in what's right for us. So yes, I'm a psychedelic advocate, quote unquote, but use your own discernment. So livefreelaurad on Instagram. So, and then I have my 3-month microdosing mastermind program coming up, and I only have a couple of spots left for that. And I have such a good group of people coming together for this program that I'm just so excited about. And it's for people who really want to deepen on the practice of their microdosing practice. And, my take on optimal performance is definitely like a different kind of take on it. It's like cultivating the sense of resilience and mind-body synchrony so that we can actually be of greater service, so that we're not, jumping in the ocean to help support other people and then drowning ourselves. It's like, okay, how do we learn to cultivate mental, emotional, physical resilience? And part of that, is through movement and all the practices, but also like cognitive practices. How do we think differently? How can we leverage our microdosing practices to tap into flow states, to think bigger, to be of greater influence and a more positive force for change on this planet? And a lot of people coming together for that program are mostly on the plant medicine path and looking to step onto the path of thought leadership and contribute to the psychedelic movement in some way, and really looking at mindsets, leadership mindsets. How do we train our mind to perceive reality differently, to build bridges where there's so much division, and bow at the altar of impermanence? That's definitely a big aspect of all of this in this time of letting go and this time of change. So I call it Jedi training for warriors of the heart tribe.
I love it. I love it. It's so powerful. And I want to thank you for everything that you're bringing. I'm definitely excited to dive deeper into your work. I invite everybody to check out the Psychedelic Leadership Podcast. Just incredible content that is just continuing to come out. I'm excited to dive deeper. I really appreciate everything that you've been pretty much bringing out to the world here for quite some time. So I encourage everybody to dive in as much as possible, and really just thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. This has been an incredible conversation.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you guys so much.
Thank
This
you,
has
Laura.
been so sweet. Yeah. I've been really enjoying just connecting with you more and getting to know you. And I just got a message from Trisha the other day saying that you guys were hanging out. I was like, oh, this is nice. You know, we're just connecting with good family, and I appreciate it. So thank you so much
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
inviting me on.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So thank you for that. We will keep this alive, and this connection as we enter this new world that really is burgeoning. So thank you for what you bring, Gordo. I want to honor you as well, not just for all the button pushing and all that behind the scenes, but you've really helped bring up the quality of these shows and everything. So I just want to honor you.
Appreciate it.
Good job,
My pleasure,
Gordo.
guys.
We did good.
Yeah.
I love
We
it.
navigated some immediate hurdles at the beginning, but you did really good. So
Yeah.
good
That's
job.
right. That's right. So I just wanted to say, I really also to the audience, I really appreciate you guys and gals, and just make sure to keep coming back here on the Ben Stewart Podcast, and I'll catch you all next time.